So, Roman numeral 6 then. So you're going to prison. And what we're talking about in this chapter is the criminal justice system and how exactly it works. We start off with the first level, which is types of crimes. In most states, and the U.S. government for that matter, crimes are graded on a scale of felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies are the more serious crimes. In most states, these are classified by letter, with the most serious crimes being a Type A felony. In North Carolina, I believe the only Type A felonies are first-degree murder and possession or use of a weapon of mass destruction. And I'm not kidding, that's actually illegal in North Carolina. Just owning a weapon of mass destruction is a Class B felony. You have to use it to get a Class A felony. So, you can keep the nuclear bomb in your backyard as long as you don't use it. Misdemeanors, on the other hand, I should say, felonies are usually punishable by jail time. So again, felonies are the bigger crime, letter grade, punishable by jail time. Misdemeanors, on the other hand, are more minor crimes. These are usually categorized by number, so a Class 1 misdemeanor, Class 2 misdemeanor. Misdemeanors are usually punishable by fines or suspended sentences or probation, so you're not necessarily going to go to jail for a misdemeanor. These are things like your speeding tickets and so on and so forth. There is actually a large collection of these laws you can find online, and if we have time, I will show them to you in class, because there are some delightfully old ones. I want to say it's a Class I felony is like railroad robbery, which, I'm not really sure is a thing anymore, but it's awesome. All sorts of weird laws, and if you dig deep enough in the North Carolina felony statutes, but not my point. So felonies and misdemeanors are your basic grades. Before you can go to criminal trial, there are a couple of things that you need. For example, a warrant. A warrant is a permission slip from a judge to the police. These come in two basic varieties, a search warrant and an arrest warrant. A search warrant is a request from the police to a judge that allows them to come onto your private property and investigate things. So a search warrant is the police saying to a judge, hey, we think he's committed a crime, we would like to look for things. Now, search warrants have to be narrow. They have to be specific. You can't just say, we would like to go and investigate crime. Can we go into his house? This would be more along the lines of, we have reason to believe that, Bob has committed a murder. We're going into his house to look for a large steak knife this big because that was the size of the wound. So it has to be very specific and so forth. Likewise, once they have found that evidence, that's where the searching has to stop. So if they find the evidence, they can't then just go through every drawer in your house looking for other things. Or, if they're looking for drugs, they can't, find a bag of drugs and then just keep looking for other stuff. It doesn't work like that. So search warrants have to have valid reason. Have to have a valid reason, and again, they can't be the only. That has to be the only thing they're looking for. Arrest warrants, on the other hand, an arrest warrant is when the police go to a judge and say, "Here's all the evidence we have. Here's why we think he's guilty, and so now we would like to arrest him." So once the arrest warrant has been issued, the police can go and arrest you and put you in jail. Now, in many states, what follows next is called the grand jury. It should be the grand jury, but again, we're Americans, so grand jury, dang it. Grand jury is the group that basically can decide what you should be charged with. In many states, the grand jury is what decides you should be charged with. So in it, the government presents the evidence that they have, and the grand jury decides they should be charged with blank, they should be charged with this or this. So like, for example, is it first-degree murder or second-degree murder or manslaughter? The grand jury is the one who's going to make that call. Or is there enough evidence to charge them at all? What the grand jury is going to return is called an indictment. It's the next word on your outline. I know it looks like it says indictment, but it's actually pronounced indictment. An indictment is basically a formal accusation. This is what we're charging you with. This is what we say you have done. You could then answer the indictment at the arraignment. The arraignment is when you stand before a judge and you answer the indictment by saying either guilty or not guilty, usually. Now, when I say usually, it's because those are the most common ones, the ones you see on TV, guilty or not guilty. But there are a couple other weird ones. For example, you can respond to the indictment with nolo contendere, which roughly translates as no contest. In a nolo contendere verdict or plea, what you're saying is, I didn't do it, but I recognize there's enough evidence that might make it look like I did. So you're basically pleading guilty without pleading guilty. The reason why you might do that is because most states, if you are found guilty or plead guilty, you are automatically considered to be a felon and have all these other strikes against you. No contest, however, lets you avoid that. So by pleading no contest to a crime, you're basically going to avoid some of the worst punishments of being a convicted felon, while still getting some punishment. There's also another option which is called an affirmative defense. An affirmative defense is basically saying, yes, I did it, but with a really good reason. For example, or with a reason that means you shouldn't punish me, I should clarify. So affirmative defense is, yes, I did it, but there's a reason or a reason you shouldn't punish me. So for example, when you hear on the news about people pleading insanity, that's an affirmative defense. Or if you're pleading self-defense, that's called an affirmative defense because it's up to you to prove it. You have to show that it was self-defense. You have to prove you were crazy. The government doesn't have to prove that part. You have to prove it, hence why it's affirmative. You have to put it forward. Now, that being said, the vast majority of cases in the United States do not go through a trial. Instead, they go through what's called a plea bargain. A plea bargain is an agreement that you make with the government to essentially avoid a trial. The way a plea bargain works is it's a deal where you agree to plead guilty to a lesser crime in exchange for a lower punishment. The government likes this because it saves them the time and money of having to do a trial, and you like this because you get a lower sentence. So for example, if you're looking at a life sentence for murder, you could get 20 years for, say, manslaughter. That's much better than life in prison, and again, it saves the government all the time and effort of having to actually put you on trial. So despite what you see on TV, the vast majority of cases are pleaded out fairly quickly. I want to say it's something like 80 to 90% in the United States as a plea bargain. It's a very high percentage. So most cases stop here. Most cases get to the plea bargain phase, and that's the end of it. This is especially true for misdemeanors. Things like parking tickets. Like, if your folks get a speeding ticket and they fill it out and they just send in the check, they're basically pleading no contest. They're saying, like, I don't want to go to trial about this. Just take my money and leave me alone. That's what that is. That's a plea bargain. Because they could theoretically go to court and challenge it and say, like, no, I wasn't speeding and I have proof. But for the most part, it's just easier to plead out. So, assuming you didn't take a plea bargain, the next step is going to trial. As we said earlier, most criminal trials in the United States are done by trial by jury. The difference here is that the jury who decides your guilt or innocence is called a petit jury, as opposed to the grand jury who decided what you should be charged with. And again, this is called a petit jury because it should be pronounced petite jury because it's French. It should be the grand jury or big jury or petite jury or small jury. But again, we's Americans, so we just pronounced it grand jury and petit jury because, hey, darn foreigners. The petit jury is the one that usually decides your guilt or innocence. However, you can ask for a bench trial. A bench trial is when the judge would decide your guilt or innocence rather than the petit jury. Bench trials are usually not recommended. The reason is because, remember, the jury's decision has to be unanimous. All 12 jurors have to agree. And if they don't, then the case basically never happened. It's easier to convince one juror that you might be innocent than, say, one judge who's, much more educated and so on and so forth. So most of the time, you don't want a bench trial, but it is your option. How do you get on jury duty? The answer is that once you register to vote, your name is put on the list of potential jurors. And then you are randomly called up for jury duty, in which case they then go through a process called voir dire. Voir dire is the process by which the lawyers interview potential jurors and decide who's going to be on the jury and who isn't. Voir dire, someone who speaks Latin can help me on this one. I'm pretty sure it basically... Oh no, voir dire it's French actually. Now that I think about it, it's like to see and speak, something like that. I'm sorry, it's late. My brain's not functioning well. But the idea behind voir dire is that the lawyers get to interview the potential jurors and say yes, he should be on the jury, or no, he shouldn't. What they're looking for are things like biases. Like if your client is on trial for rape, you don't want a rape victim on the jury because they're more likely to find him guilty. It's generally not a good idea, but. They also have a certain number of challenges that they can make for pretty much any reason. Now, it is illegal/unconstitutional to kick someone off a jury simply because of things like race or gender, unless you can prove they are biased because of race or gender. But, for example, automatically disqualifying a juror simply because he's African American is probably going to get you in trouble. So, jury's been seated, the trial goes on. In order to win a trial, you have to do what's called the burden of proof. The burden of proof is basically who's responsible for proving their case and what do they have to prove. In a criminal trial, the burden of proof is on the government, on the prosecution or the government, and it's called reasonable doubt. So the burden of proof is on the government, on the prosecution, and it's called reasonable doubt, meaning the government has to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning that your guilt has to be the only logical conclusion. Keyword there being logical, not the only conclusion, but the only logical conclusion. Because if you think about it, you can't eliminate every single possibility. So like, you can't prove it wasn't space aliens that ran over my mother-in-law, but I don't have to because that's not logical. There's no way that space aliens did it that we know of. That would have been better if I'd queued the music up a little bit better, but still, you can't prove it wasn't space aliens that ran over my mother-in-law. In any case, so reasonable doubt simply means that your guilt has to be the only logical conclusion, which is why, for example, they can convict someone of murder without ever actually having a dead body. It's weird and rare, but it does happen. Because in other words, like you were the last person to see, the victim, we haven't found the victim, and there's a lot of their blood all over your car. Even though we don't know where the body is, the most logical explanation is you done killed him. On the other hand, in a civil trial, the burden of proof is called beyond a preponderance of the evidence. And a preponderance of the evidence just means a majority of the evidence. So in order to win a lawsuit, you only need about 51% of the evidence on your side, as opposed to reasonable doubt, which is like 85% of the evidence. So it's purposely easier to win a civil trial than a criminal trial, which is why, take for example O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty in a criminal trial, but found liable in a civil trial. And that's because the majority of the evidence was that he committed murder, but not enough beyond a reasonable doubt to convict him of murder. So slightly different burdens of proof. The other thing is that the burden of proof in a civil trial is essentially balanced. Either side is responsible for it. So whoever has the preponderance of the evidence will win the case. Whereas in a criminal case, the burden of proof is only on the government. They have to prove you're guilty. You don't have to prove you're innocent. So in other words, it's not my job to prove who did do it, just that I'm not guilty, I did not do it. Now then, under outcome, as we said earlier, the outcome of a criminal trial, if you're found guilty, you're going to jail. If you're found liable in a civil case, you're going to owe money. That's the big difference, is that in a civil trial, you're not going to go to jail for it. Otherwise, I think that's about all you needed to know there. I'm really not sure what else you're looking for. So again, you might not end up using this video in case we are back to school on Friday, but on the off chance that we are out for 3 days, you'll need to make sure you've watched all of this because you will have a test on Monday or Tuesday, and make sure you do your clued in and so forth. And you're back. I told you to leave. Why are you back? No, it's the government duck. He's mad that I fired him. Darn you, government duck! Okay, I think he's subdued. So again, make sure you read all of your information to make sure that you're ready for the test on Monday or Tuesday because you never know quite what's going to happen with the weather. No!